Tubbing boy suffers bullying, but his pit bull appears, and what he did left everyone shaken. The midday sun beat the worn cement court of the school. San Martin municipal heat made the children sweat profusely while were trying with disparate energies to complete the physical education activity. Mateo Fernandez, a 12-year-old boy, years of slim build and always somewhat sorrowful face, he was standing at the edge of the court with his hands sweaty, tightening the hem of his shirt. He didn't like football, and a lot. Unless they forced him to play, he knew that he was not good at that sport, and that he was not good at it. Fernandez enters the field, shouted the teacher, a man, a robust man with a silvato, always hanging from his neck, and an evident disinterest in the dynamics between the Bodici. Mateo swallowed hard and slowly advanced towards the center of the court. I knew what was coming. On the opposite team there was Santiago Gomez, a boy, tall and with a mocking smile that always led the humiliations towards him at his side like an obedient shadow. There was Luis Torres, who laughed at every sarcastic comment of Santiago, although rec. His laughter seemed always forced. The ball began to roll the backhead. Shouts and orders filled the air while the most skilled boys fought for possession. Mateo stayed. Hazel Streets in a corner of the field trying to go unnoticed, but his nervousness was. Evidently looked sideways at Santiago, who threw him looks full of mockery as he ran after the ball of. Suddenly, the professor blew his syllabito and threw the ball towards Mateo. The impact. Neen, of all eyes on him, was immediately paralyzed for a second. Feeling his heart pounding in his ears, he lifted one foot awkwardly to try control the ball, and although he managed to keep it for a brief moment, his movements were slow and trick. Santiago ran towards him like a predator chasing his prey. Pass it, Fernandez, or you're going to. Tripping over yourself, Santiago mocked with a smile. Tilted, Mateo tried to turn, but a poorly placed foot made him lose the Kamtia. Balanced the ball, shot towards a player of the opposing team who he took the opportunity to score a goal. The other team's triumphant cry resounded throughout the field, followed by the thunderous laughter of Mateo Santiago's teammates. Of course it was the most scandalous incredible, exclaimed this guy, with theatricality not even to hinder. Matthew felt his cheeks burn as murmurs and laughter enveloped him like a wave wanted. Disappear sink into the cement under his feet. His hands trembled as he yelled. He tried not to look at anyone. The professor's eyes briefly passed by him, but Chachutatis. He did not make any comment, limiting himself to pointing out that the game would continue. Santiago Keter approached as they walked towards their positions. Fernandez, get ready, because when the class is over, we're going to show you what it means to lose. Really, he whispered with a smile. Threatening Luis behind him let out a short laugh, but avoided looking directly. Mateo seemed uncomfortable, but he didn't say anything. Mateo didn't answer. He couldn't know that if he said anything, it would only worsen the situation. When the Silvato finally. The teacher announced the end of the class. Matthew felt a momentary relief, mixed with a growing terror of. Waiting for Santiago to carry out his threat, he ran to the locker room, picked up his backpack, and went to the Grome. He walked quickly towards the exit of the school. His steps were hurried, his hands sweated as much as during the game, and his breathing was irregular. On the way home, Santiago's words echoed in his mind like a constant echo. He couldn't stop thinking. In the humiliation of the field, and in the laughter that had C-H-A-S-E-D, him to the exit. He looked at the ground as he walked. Without noticing the clear sky or the suffocating heat, his thoughts were Azor's Gulbais, whirlwind of insecurities. Why, I whispered to herself. Himself with a lump in his throat. He wiped himself quickly, a tear that threatened to fall. He didn't want to cry. Number, not here. Now, when he turned the corner, he saw the family facade of his house. The mere fact of seeing her gave him a slight consolation, accelerated El Paso, and reached his fourth. The only place where he felt safe. He knew that Aries would be there. Waiting with his usual enthusiasm to think of his faithful companion, he did. Pursing her lips, holding back a bland, climbed the steps of the open entrance. The door, and let the sound of closing behind him mark the end of a day he longed for. Forget the sound of the door closing resounded throughout the house. Mateo. He dropped his backpack by the entrance. Trying not to make a sound, took a deep breath. Trying to calm the trembling in his hands, he wanted to cross the room quickly and go up to his room, but the Baja, his mother's voice, stopped him from the kitchen. "Mateo is you?" asked Dolores, peeking out the door with a wooden spoon in her hand and her hair in a bun. In disarray, Mateo looked up for just a moment, trying to crack a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Yes. Mom, I'm just tired," he replied, preventing his voice from giving away the nod end. His throat aches. He looked at him for a moment, as if trying to decipher him. But then he nodded and went back to the kitchen. "It's okay. Dinner will be ready in a braco." Mateo went to the backyard, desperately looking for the only company that knew she would not ask him questions or judge him as soon as the sound of the K. Aries' legs rushing towards him filled the air of the pit bull with his brown fur. Bright and white spots on his chest, jumped excitedly, wagging his tail with a contagious ball energy, friend said. Matthew, in a broken whisper, bent down to wrap his arms around the dog. Aries licked his face as if tried to wipe away the tears that were beginning to roll down his cheeks. Matthew let the weight of his day spilled out in silence as he hugged his partner. They sat together on the lawn with Aries supporting his head on the boy's lap, emitting soft grunts that seemed to tell him, "I'm here, why it has to be like this." Matthew asked quietly as he ran his fingers through Aries' fur, "Why can't I be like everyone else? Why I'm always the one they choose?" Aries looked at him with his big dark eyes filled with a silent understanding that only dogs seem. Mateo lay down on the grass, looking at the sky that was beginning to be dyed orange hues as the sun descended the cool evening air and realized Aries' calm presence helped him calm down a little. Although the weight on his chest was still there, thoughts took him back to the day Aries came into their lives. He was barely 8 years old when Dolores appeared in house with a cardboard box in his arms. Mateo clearly remembered how. The air was filled with emotion. When I heard a small moan from inside the box, "I have a surprise for you, Mateo," Dolores said with a smile, placing the box on the floor in front of him. Mateo. He approached cautiously, and when he opened the box, he saw a small pit bull puppy with the legs too big for his body and the wet muzzle. The puppy looked at him curiously before stumbling to him and licked his fingers. "What is it for me?" Mateo asked, with his eyes shining. Of emotion, Paines nodded. "Yes, I found him in a shelter. I thought you could need a friend." From that moment on, Aries and Mateo became. The cub grew up quickly, but his sweetness and loyalty never changed. Every ride, every game in the world, the courtyard, every night Aries slept by his bed during a storm, strengthened the bond between them. Aries. He was not just a dog. He was his companion, his refuge, in a world that often seemed too cruel. Returning to the Durham present, Mateo got up from the grass and threw a stick on the other side of the patio. He ran after him with the usual energy, as if the world were perfect in that little corner of the Pernas universe. Mateo couldn't help but smile as he saw his friend return triumphant with the stick in his mouth. "You are Naigasan, the best Aries, you know." That's what he said, caressing the pick-in dog's head. The sound of Dolores' voice from the kitchen called him back to reality. "Matthew, come to dinner." "I'll go right away," he replied. Although his voice was still full of melancholy, he entered the house with Aries. Following him closely during dinner, Dolores tried to talk to him about, but Mateo just answered with monosyllables. He didn't want to worry her, even though she kept watching him with a mixture of curiosity and concern. When he finally finished to eat, Matthew went up to his room, closing the door. Falling on the bed, looking at the ceiling, AR settled on the floor next to the bed. Emitting a soft sigh, Matthew turned off the light, hoping that the darkness would. It brought some relief, but the memories of the day did not leave him in peace. The laughter, Foff of the Bulis resounded in his mind, mingling with the words of Santiago that continued to turn him around. "Get ready. Let's show you what it means to really lose." Matthew turned in bed, trying to find a comfortable position, but his mind wouldn't shut down. He felt the weight of what he could. Tomorrow, the fear of facing his bullies again sighed, looking at the shadow of turned in bed. Aries on the ground, knowing that his friend was there, gave him some comfort, but not enough to calm your thoughts. "What am I going to do?" Aries whispered in the dark, though he knew there was no easy answer. The pit bull raised his head and looked at him silently, as if he understood Mateo. He closed his eyes tightly, trying to push the fear out of his mind. But the dream didn't come, only the tic-tac of the Pizzas clock and Aries' steady breathing filled the room as the weight of his worries kept him awake. Caught between the past and fear, the next day the sun was just beginning to rise. When Mateo arrived at the entrance of the San Martin Municipal School, his backpack hung heavily on his his shoulder. Not because of its content, but because of the emotional weight he felt. His eyes avoided looking at the bashash. Other students who congregated in small groups, laughing and chatting before classes began. Their goal was. Clara went unnoticed and avoided Santiago and his group at all costs. Across the main hallway, Mateo kept his gaze fixed on the floor he could. To feel the looks of some teammates who recognized him as the boy who ruined the game the day before. Murmurs were soft, but to Matthew every laugh and every comment seemed deafening. Fernandez Santiago's voice made him stop in seco. Mateo turned slowly, seeing Santiago leaning against a wall with his arms crossed and a sarcastic smile on his face. Face next to him was Luis, who avoided eye contact, looking towards. "I don't want to be there where you think you're going so fast," Santiago asked, advancing a couple of steps towards him. His tone was almost light. Casual, but Mateo knew that he always hid a threat. "Leave me alone," Mateo murmured. "Just audibly what you said, Santiago." The nearest exit was at the end of the corridor, but I didn't think I could get there without being. "Look, if you're going to run like a coward, at least do it right. Yesterday, almost. No, you moved in the game." Santiago added provoking laughter from the other boys. Even Luis let out a faint laugh. Although his expression was still uncomfortable, Mateo pursed his lips and without thought about it too much, he turned quickly to the door of the men's bathroom, hoping to find shelter. Momentarily entered and closed the door behind him, breathing deeply as he tried to calm the beating of his heart. The relief was brief. Santiago and Taeres, his group, entered. Shortly after filling the small bathroom with his intimidating presence, Mateo took a step back, watching as Santiago inspected the place with a satisfied smile. "This is a good place too. A private chat you don't believe," Santiago said while one of his friends blocked the door. "Please let me," Mateo asked with his voice. Trembling, Santiago approached slowly like a predator stalking its prey. Before Mateo could react, he was pushed into one of the cabins. The door slammed shut, and before he could open it, he heard the metallic sound of an improvised bolt from the outside was trapped. "There, you'll be fine for a while," Santiago said, laughing. His friends joined in the laughter, and the echo on the walls of the bathroom made everything sound even more. "Let me out!" Mateo shouted, banging on the door of the cabin, but his voice was drowned out by laughter and sarcastic comments. "Don't worry, Fernandez. Maybe someone will find you someday," he teased before going out with his, leaving the bathroom empty except for the sound of Matthew's heavy breathing. The silence that followed was even more oppressive. Mateo slumped on the toilet lid with trembling hands and sighed, the eyes full of tears. The narrow space of the cabin made him feel as if the air was getting heavier. With each passing minute, the smell of humidity and the echo of their own soybeans. They were her only company. Every one at the door, every attempt to force her, ended in failure. Despair grew within him, feeding a whirlwind of thoughts. Dark felt invisible, insignificant, like no one would notice I was trapped. No. He knew how much time had passed when he heard the sound of footsteps approaching. Matthew held his breath, fearing that it was Santiago and his group returning to continue their torture. But instead, a deep voice, an acquaintance, broke the silence. "There is someone here?" asked Carlos. The old man. School janitor Mateo got up quickly, getting as close as he could. At the door, "Here I am," he shouted hoarsely. For the previous attempts, Carlos pushed the main door of the bathroom and entered with his cleaning cart. When he saw the closed cabin, he frowned. "What are you doing there?" Inside boy asked while checking the improvised sock. "They locked me up, please." "Get me out of here," replied Mateo. His voice broken with relief, Charles let out a flash. Snorting, shaking his head disapprovingly, he took out a screwdriver from his cart, and with some quick movements, Mateo managed to free the door. He left the cabin with red eyes and hands too. "Who did this?" asked Carlos Cruzando. Arms. Mateo lowered his gaze, unable to answer. He didn't want major problems, but shame consumed him. "Banned. Go wash your face. Don't let them see you like this," Carlos said, softening his tone, patted him on the shoulder before. To return to his work, Matthew went to the lavabo, letting the cold water soothe his face and his thoughts as he looked in the mirror. He saw a tired boy, but biased. Determined not to let anyone see him break again, he put his things away and left the bathroom quietly, wishing that The day would soon end. The sun was already beginning to set behind the buildings. When Mateo hurriedly left the school, he was walking, with quick steps, almost tripping over himself as his backpack hit his back with every movement. Had waited until most of the students had left to avoid crossing paths with Santiago and his group. Yet fear followed him like a shadow, constantly looking over him, feeling that at any moment someone would call him by his name with that mocking tone that he already knew so well. Decided to take an alternate route home. The narrow street that crossed a group of old houses was more solitary, but it also meant fewer witnesses. Something that at this moment I preferred. The sound of their footsteps resounded on the sidewalk, mixing with the intermittent hum of the lampposts. The sky was dull orange, and the first stars were beginning to appear. Mateo breathed deeply, trying to calm down, but could not shake the feeling that the noise of laughter was being watched. Made him stop at Seco, turned his head slowly, and saw some meters behind him the tall figure of Santiago, together with his inseparable group. Santiago smiled with that grimace of superiority that Mateo already knew too well. Fernandez shouted Santiago, raising a hand as if greeting him. "Quickly, you were waiting for us." Mateo's heart began to beat with. He tried to pick up the pace, but so did James and the others. Matthew turned a corner, going deeper into the alley, hoping they would give up, but they had no intention of leaving him. "Escape! Come on! Don't hide!" shouted another of the boys, laughing. Finally, Mateo was trapped. The alley ended in a high wall with ivy partially covering the worn bricks. There was no way out. He turned slowly, watching as Santiago and the others approached, calmly blocking any possibility of really back away. "You thought you could get away?" Santiago asked, shaking his head with feigned disappointment. "Alone?" "Leave me alone," murmured Matthew, though his voice was barely audible. Santiago River taking a step towards him. "That depends. Fernandez, maybe, if you learn to be more useful, although I doubt it," he said, pushing him gently toward the wall. Matthew slammed into the bricks, feeling the roughness of the surface on his back. His breathing became faster as he tried to keep his composure. Luis, who was next to Santiago, looked uncomfortable, looking at the ground instead of Mateo. Santiago already. "Leave it is enough," said Luis finally, with a low voice. Santiago low. He looked out of the corner of his eye, arching an eyebrow. "What's up Luis gave you?" "Too bad," he asked in a mocking tone. "If you want to leave, go. But no, wait for us to cover you later." Luis did not answer, but Mateo Lowe did not move either. He looked, looking for some hint of support, but Luis's silence only made him feel more alone. Santiago turned around, again to Matthew, now with a more serious expression. "Sometimes I think you need a reminder of your place, don't you think?" she said, raising a hand as if was about to push him back. A low and menacing sound broke the air, stopping everyone. In Seco was a casa, deep continuous growl coming from somewhere behind them. Santiago, "Haste, Calamings," froze, turning his head slowly at the entrance to the alley as soon as can ass. Illuminated by the dim light of a pole was Eris. The pit bull looked like a boho, a figure out of a nightmare. His brown fur shone in the light in his ears. They were tense and her teeth poked out from under her raised lip, her normally warm and furca kind. Now they seemed dark and calculating. They gave the impression of being evaluating each of the boys, deciding who would be the first to attack which demon. Santiago murmured, taking a step back. Ares slowly advanced, each movement accompanied by the echo of his claws on the ground. His growl grew louder and louder. Mateo could see how his dog's tail remained rigid, as a clear sign that he was ready to act alone. "A dog?" said one of the boys, though his voice trembled. "He doesn't look like just a dog," Luis replied, taking a step back. Mateo observed the scene with his heart in his throat. On the one hand, he felt immense relief at seeing Ares there, protecting him as he always did. But on the other hand, he knew that the situation could. Santiago easily getting out of control, trying to regain his posture. He raised a hand as if he could get into the long people here, he shouted, but his voice lacked the usual confidence. Ares didn't move. His growl turned into a prupertin. Explosive bark that resounded throughout Santiago Street jumped backwards. Completely losing his composure, Mateo felt a whirlwind of emotions. He wanted Ares to teach them a lesson that would scare them so much that they would never dare to bother him again, but at the same time, "I knew that if Ares attacked, things could get worse for all of Ares," he muttered, but his voice was drowned out by the sound of another fierce bark on. Pitbull advanced a couple of steps closer to Santiago, who tripped and fell to the ground. Luis tried to help him. He got up, but his hands were shaking so much that Mateo could barely hold him. He clenched his fists, feeling the weight of the decision he had to make. He could leave. That Ares acted by instinct, letting fear become his shield. Or he could intervene and show that he was stronger than everyone believed. His eyes met Ares's, and at that moment he knew that he had to decide. Matthew clenched his fists as his mind struggled with thoughts. Contradictory, a part of him wanted to let Ares act, to teach those bullies what the real thing was. Fear wanted them to feel a fraction of the terror he had carried for so long, but there was something else to it. A small voice inside him telling him that he couldn't let the situation get out of control. Ves, Basta muttered, but his voice just came out like a whisper. The pit bull didn't react. His eyes kept going. Fixed in Santiago, his teeth still uncovered, Mateo knew that he had to. To be firmer, he took a deep breath, gathering all the strength he had inside himself, and took a step forward, Ares to shout this time with a care. The dog turned his head towards him, eyes meeting Matthew's for an instant. All was silent, except for the breath. Hess of Santiago and the others. Ares slowly lowered his head, leaving. Grunting but keeping alert, Mateo knelt down, stretching out a hand towards his friend. "Come here, Ares. Everything is fine," he said in a more soft. Although his hands were trembling, Ares took a few steps towards him, relaxing his. Matthew felt immense relief when the pit bull finally came to his side, floating his head against his leg. Ran a hand through Ares's fur, feeling his own heart rate begin to thivy. Santiago, still on the ground, let out a sigh that seemed to contain all the four. He looked at Matthew with a mixture of confusion and embarrassment as he was trying to get up. Luis rushed to help him, but he couldn't even hold his gaze. "No, I want to see him close to me again," said Mateo, in a tone that surprised even himself. His words were firm, something he had never felt before. Santiago did not respond in a way that he had never felt before. Immediately he brushed the dust off his clothes, avoiding looking at Mateo, his friends. They muttered something inaudible. Before they began to slowly back away, Luis was the last to move, throwing a quick glance at Matthew as if he wanted to say something, but finally he turned around and followed the others on the goalless Zolmelier Khad. Silence filled the alley again. Mateo stood still, caressing the keys. Ares' head as he watched the bullies walk away. I felt a mixture. Strange emotions, relief, pride, but also a slight fear of what might happen. "Masa." After passing, Ares looked at him, tilting his head as if waiting for a signal from him. "You did well, friend. Thank you for being here," Matthew whispered, leaning over to Eason. Hugging the pit bull with a sigh, Mateo began to walk towards the exit of the Iwashitora alley, with Ares stuck to its side. The lampposts flickered faintly, creating shadows that lengthened and shrank with each step. The atmosphere was more calm now, but Mateo's mind was still working at full speed. As he made his way through the streets towards his home, the events of the confrontation continued to play out. In his mind, he had been afraid, very afraid, but he had taken control of it by a contour. The first time he felt that he had faced something that he always thought impossible, he looked at Ares, who was walking with his head held high and couldn't help but smile a little when finally he reached the door of his house. Mateo took a deep breath before opening it. The interior was silent. With the living room light on and the familiar smell of his mother's dinner wafting through the air, he put down his backpack. Cambiji, he put down his backpack by the entrance and crouched once more to caress Ares, seized the bigataus. "You know," he said, with a tired but sincere smile. Ares waggled his tail as if. Matthew closed the door behind them, leaving the wait. Out of the day, at least for a moment, I knew I'd taken an important step. But he also knew that the consequences of his decision were yet to come. The following days, the confrontation in the alley brought a change that Mateo had never imagined for the first time in. He walked to school for a long time without that unbearable weight on his chest, even though the memories of the teasing were still alive in his mind. There was something different in the air as he reached the halls, he noticed. As the bullies, especially Sago, avoided crossing paths with him, he no longer listened. The murmurs and laughter directed at him. There was silence, but not silence. Oppressive that he knew, but one that brought tranquility during recess. Mateo. He sat under the tree in the courtyard as he always did, but this time some classmates approached one of them. Diego, a boy from his class. He greeted shyly before sitting next to him. "Hey, Mateo, I saw what happened to Santiago." "You were very brave," Diego said, with a sincere smile. Mateo looked at him, surprised, but managed to smile back soon. The conversation flowed from. In a natural way, and before he knew it, others joined in. Mateo began to feel that the wall that had always existed between him and the others was beginning to crumble for the first time. Part of something when he got home that day, Aries ran to him as always. Mateo bent down to hug him, letting the weariness of the day fade into the warmth of his. "Mate, we're getting it done, friend," he whispered, as he stroked the pit bull's head that night while they were having dinner. Dolores watched her son more closely. She had noticed changes in him once. More upright posture, a different energy in his gaze finally. Decided to ask Mateo what has been happening. "I have noticed you differently these Jays," he said, putting the fork aside. Mateo hesitated for a moment, but then he took a breath and began to speak. For the first time he told her everything. The mockery, the fear, that he felt every day, the confrontation with Santiago. And as Aries had been there to support him, Dolores heard it in silence with her eyes full of emotion. When Mateo finished, she got up from his cell, the table, and hugged him tightly. "I didn't know you were going through all that, son, but I'm so proud of you. I promise I'll be more attentive from now on," said his voice trembling slightly. Mateo felt an enormous relief. When he heard those words he feared that telling his mother everything would make him seem weak, but instead he felt that the connection between them was. The following days were a reflection of this new stage in the courtyard. As Mateo and Aries spent hours playing as usual, but this time with a different joy. Pains joined. Laughing as he watched his son run alongside his dog was a moment of peace, a respite after so many storms. An afternoon while the sun began to get, Mateo decided to go for a walk with Aries. The pit bull trotted at Kidzol his side with his tail wagging from side to side. Mateo looked at the streets of Denor, his neighborhood, with a new perspective. Every step he took with Aries was a reminder that he was no longer. It was the same boy who used to hide from others when he crossed a corner. Met Diego, and some of the classmates who had approached him at school smiled at him and greeted them enthusiastically. Mateo replied naturally, something that he would have said before. "Menig season. We're going to look like it," said Aries, patting the right, before continuing to walk as they advanced along the street lit by the circumrumiri. The last rays of the sun. Matthew felt a calm that he had never experienced before Aries walked beside him, his firm presence and loyal. As always, Mateo smiled, knowing that no matter whatever came now, I was ready to face it. I had found my strength in Pia Sola. With it, a new beginning. A Spanish, auto-generated.